Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everyone. US-China relations have been especially antagonistic these last several weeks. There are a lot of moving parts which we need to be aware of, so let's start today's video by moving through the most salient developments on this front. It is being reported by both UK and US-based outlets, citing multiple unnamed sources, that Michael Chase, the US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China, the Pentagon's top China official, will make an official trip to Taiwan in the coming days. This would be the first senior defense official to visit Taipei since 2019, and the second in over 40 years. From China's perspective, this would be a provocative move during any time, but particularly so now as Beijing and Washington spar over the ongoing balloon saga. More on this soon. The diplomatic mood is tense. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who recently cancelled a planned Beijing trip due to the balloon incident, is trying to meet with his counterpart, Wang Yi, at the Munich Security Conference this weekend. The Chase trip is a sign of just how concerned the Pentagon and the White House has become over the cross-strait situation. A Pentagon spokesperson speaking to UK-based Financial Times expressed to the outlet yesterday, quote, "Our commitment to Taiwan is rock solid and contributes to the maintenance and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and within the region." End quote. Adding that America's, quote, "support for and defense relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China." End quote. We will cover the trip and any fallout as it happens. Next up for US-China developments, and on a similar theme, yesterday, Tuesday, China's Ministry of Commerce announced sanctions on US defense companies Lockheed Martin Corporation and Raytheon Missiles and Defense for their arms sales contracts with Taiwan. They have been given 15 days to pay the fine. These measures are likely to be largely symbolic, given both have little direct exposure to China. According to state media coverage of the government announcement of the sanctions, the two firms will also be barred from engaging in China-related import or export activities and are forbidden to make new investments in China. Senior executives of the two companies are also prohibited from entering China, though I don't suspect they had had many plans on visiting. Meanwhile, China's state media and diplomatic anti-US blitz this week, which we covered a few days ago, continues. Just one example from the coverage should suffice today. Quote, "While the US continues to buy into the dual fallacy of being the city upon a hill and a beacon of democracy, the reality on the ground tells a different story. An increasingly large swath of the American population struggling with drug abuse, growing worries around gun violence, an ever-widening economic gap between the haves and have-nots, intensifying political polarization, more arbitrary detention of, and hatred towards minorities." End quote. The outlet explains that this is the first in a new series of articles on, quote, "socio-political and economic forms of chaos in the United States." End quote. Now, while we're here, let's also examine another Chinese voice, this one being an important one to listen to. One of China's most respected US specialists, Da Wei, is a professor of international relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing and the director of its prestigious Center for International Security and Strategy. In a recently published and widely shared article, Professor Da laid out his view on how China should engage with the US and the wider world. His comments give us some insight into how Beijing policymakers could be thinking about these questions too. Let's move through a useful English listing of his main points provided by the Sinification newsletter. These are Professor Da Wei's arguments. As we read through them, we can feel an academic heavily constrained by an ideological zeitgeist trying his best to advocate pragmatic policies. 1. US policymakers are now determined to exclude China from today's interconnected world and are prepared to pay a price for doing so. 2. In the face of US attempts to decouple from China in certain areas, Beijing must respond in a way that does not end up exacerbating this trend. 3. China must preserve and strengthen its connections with the outside world. This applies in particular to its ties with developed countries, and thus also with the US. Only by doing so will China be able to prosper. 4. Except for matters that touch upon China's core interests, Beijing should avoid responding to American provocations in a tit-for-tat way and should focus its efforts on building bridges with the US and the rest of the world. 5. Xi's emphasis on developing China's fighting spirit and on being good at struggling does not necessarily imply that China should become more aggressive. This, he says, should be understood as advocating compromise and cooperation with the outside world. 6. If productive engagement is not possible with Washington, Beijing should focus on strengthening its ties with groups and individuals at the local level in the US, state level, officials, academics, businesses, etc. 7. When the US is attacking China, it is more important for Beijing to enhance its ties with Europe and countries in the Asia-Pacific, and be a little more tolerant with these countries than it would otherwise be with the US. This is a very PC way of saying we are in conflict with the US, so we can't afford to mess things up with Europe and Japan. Meanwhile, the balloon saga continues. Yesterday, the US Senate has joined the House of Representatives by passing a condemnation of China over its alleged spy balloon. Then, the same day, on the other side of the Pacific, China's Foreign Affairs Committee of the National People's Congress condemned the US House of Representatives' condemnation of them. Now, finally, on this first part on US-China relations, US President Biden has given a brief statement about the recent balloon incidents. In his comments, the US leader expressed that he would be speaking to General Secretary Xi Jinping very soon, saying, quote, "I expect to be speaking with President Xi, and I hope we are going to get to the bottom of this." End quote. Okay, that is US-China. Next up, the economy. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this episode of China Update, as always, don't forget to hit that like button. If you have not subscribed to China Update and you find you're enjoying these sort of episodes, maybe consider subscribing, hit that bell notification, and you'll be on top of the most up-to-date analysis as it's released. And as always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help keep the channel sustainable. It is certainly an uphill battle with YouTube's algorithm. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Before we move on to the economy, the quote of the week. This week it's from the Party's Standing Committee, which yesterday declared that China has declared victory over the first wave of Omicron, which washed over the country in December and January. The quote speaks for itself and gives us a succinct rendering of the narrative Beijing is presenting domestically about the abandonment of zero COVID, opening up, and the massive first wave. Quote, "China has achieved a major and decisive victory. From November 2022, China's COVID-19 response has made a smooth transition in a relatively short time, with more than 200 million people accessing medical services, nearly 800,000 severe cases receiving proper treatment, and the country's COVID-19 fatality rate remaining the world's lowest. China has created a miracle in human history, in which a highly populous nation has successfully pulled through a pandemic. It has been proven through practice that the CPC Central Committee has been right in its judgment of the pandemic situation, major response decisions, and major strategy adjustments." End quote. Okay, and with that, let's move on to the economy. Bloomberg's Hong Kong team reports today that a $2 trillion swath of China's local bond market is, quote, approaching a risky inflection point as issuers struggle to refinance maturing debt, end quote. The outlet's analysts explained that, according to data provided by S&P Global Ratings, net financing, new yuan bond issuances minus maturities, for the country's local government financing vehicles turned negative in the fourth quarter of 2022 for the first time in at least 4 years, adding that while the measure turned positive in January, it was still down 83% from a year earlier at 48.9 billion yuan. $7.1 billion. Some commentators fear that this funding slump is a red flag which could threaten financial stability, and at the very least, it's yet another sign that local government debt markets are increasingly looking shaky. According to a recent Huaan Securities research note, 22 local government financing bond issuers missed deadlines on commercial bill payments in January, up from 17 in December. Only a few years ago, local government financing vehicle bonds, representing trillions of dollars in debt, were considered rock solid and firmly backed by the state. Now, investors cannot be so sure. Indeed, Fitch Ratings observed recently in a report that some local government financing vehicle bond issuers, under the guidance of local government backers, could unilaterally extend loan maturity terms or force other forms of restructuring on bondholders. Indeed, one large construction company in Guizhou province has already done just that. Such an act would have the same effect on investor confidence in the asset class as a default would. Quote, investors should stay highly vigilant of lower quality local government financing vehicles from high risk areas. If refinancing is further hampered and the government's resources cannot be deployed in a timely manner, there may be more debt repayment crises or even public bond defaults. End quote. Impoverished provinces, Hunan, Henan, and Guizhou, had the highest numbers of late-paying local government financing vehicles, but surprisingly, the relatively wealthy Jiangsu, home to Nanjing and Suzhou, also had several local government financing vehicle issuers that missed payment deadlines on commercial bills. Analysts argue that rapidly increasing yields are pushing private firms and local government financing vehicles alike to put off bond sales. Bloomberg writes that spreads on 3-year onshore corporate bonds, rated AAA, reached their widest level since 2020 in mid-December. They have since narrowed but remain well above last year's average level. Greater scrutiny of local government debt was identified as a key policy priority at last year's Central Economic Work Conference. However, this is easier said than done. As we have discussed in previous videos, China's current growth model requires that when real growth is lower than the growth target, which is most years, local governments must step in with fiscal tools to make up the difference. Because of spending constraints placed on local governments by Beijing, in order to finance this fiscal spending, they turn to special purpose bonds or local government financing vehicles. They could also sell assets, though this almost never happens, as it is unpopular and politically quite difficult. Thus, as all local governments are expected to maintain artificially high growth levels, they will be forced to turn to implicit debt, even as the trillion-dollar market looks increasingly unhealthy. And of course, like almost every sector of the Chinese economy, the property crisis has made things much worse. Last year, we covered the practice of local governments making their local government financing vehicles purchase land use rights in order to provide fiscal revenue and prevent land prices from collapsing as crisis-hit private developers stayed away. Guangfa Securities Co. Limited, in a recent note, estimated that last year, local government financing vehicles purchased over 2.2 trillion yuan, $320 billion, of residential land use rights, which they will hold and hope to sell to private developers in the future, though frankly, we will likely see large swaths sold to state-backed developers. From Peter to Paul, then back to Peter. And despite this local government financing vehicle intervention, revenue from land use sales still plunged by a quarter last year. By December last year, local government financing vehicles had about 13.5 trillion yuan of outstanding onshore bonds. That is approximately $2 trillion. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a lovely day, have a great weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.